Hello, and welcome back to the Emerge Stronger podcast. Today, my guest is Rhonda Velez. She is a coach, and she specifically helps women find their calling and purpose by engaging in their stories. Rhonda, I am so happy to have you on today, and we have just recently met each other, and I feel like, wow, we need to go to coffee or lunch or something because what do we
Right?
talk about?
I know. It's so nice to meet you, and I love that I met you through my daughter. That's the best way, to meet people is through somebody that you know. So thank you for having me on today.
Yes, you're welcome. Well, I'm happy you're here. And the reason I asked you to be on the podcast is, I reached out to you through, or you responded through a
Mhm.
social media post. And so looking for a topic on parenting and you approached or you commented and I thought it was the perfect topic because I didn't have anybody else that could touch that topic. And so today we're talking about parenting adult children. And
Yeah.
so I would love to hear from you. I guess just tell us a little bit about yourself and your family and how many kids you have and yeah.
Yes. So I have been married 28 years and I have two grown daughters. One is 21 and the other is 27. I almost said her wrong age. She just turned 27 and she is married. So I am in that place where we are empty nesters, but we are also, what were we saying, coaches before we got on this call? We are coaches to adults. We are not really parenting anymore.
Right. Sure. Yeah. Okay. And so you 21 and 27. And I guess I would even love to hear before we kind of dive into the topic of parenting adult children. Let's talk about like, kind of that transition. And, I shared with you that my daughter, she'll be 20 in a couple weeks. And so there was definitely a transition from that 18 to 20. And so I guess share with me a little bit about, your experience in that.
Yeah, so it was two very different experiences because my older daughter went away to college. So I feel like that's just a different transition because they're kind of not in your house, they're not living with you, which I will say that was really hard. I remember when she was getting ready to move out and I would see her all with all her boxes, packing them up, getting ready to go to school, and I couldn't even look in her room. I would like had to literally shut her door because I would freak out every time I saw it because her and I, very close, a very close relationship. And I feel like my relationship with my two daughters are very different. They're very in what they need from me has always been a little bit different. My younger daughter, we moved here to Tennessee in 2021. She was 18 years old. She was a senior in high school,
Wow.
which my mama heart was like, I hope I don't screw her up forever because I'm pulling her out of her senior year. The only saving grace was that California was still kind of in this COVID space.
Yeah.
And so they allowed her to do virtual school and she was able to graduate with her class. We were able to fly back to California, graduate with her class. But she did not get to really experience high school at all because she was literally in high school, what, a year and a half before COVID happened. So it was very different. And then she decided that she really didn't love college. She tried junior college, didn't love it, and decided to become an esthetician. So she went to esthetician school and she's still currently, living with us right now. It doesn't make sense for her to be spending the money on rent. But again, she is an adult. So it is hard because we're trying to kind of make that transition from I'm your mom to you're kind of my roommate and you're, need some coaching and some help in certain areas, but without stepping on boundaries.
Yeah. Oh gosh. I'm living in that right now with the oldest. And
Mhm.
even in, kind of conversation. So the latest thing is, she's like, "I wanna move out and I wanna be on my own." And I get that. Like, when I was her age, I was moved out and I was on my own, but we live in such different times. And like you're saying, like,
Right.
rent is so expensive.
Yeah.
And so now she's kind of on this track where she's like, "Well, maybe I'll start saving to buy a house." And I'm like,
Yes.
for you, yes.
Mhm.
But to the coaching piece of it, there's the parenting aspect of it, but also talking to her, and my husband's really good at this,
Mhm.
and coaching her through that. Let's talk about what this looks like. And let's
Yeah.
talk about, okay, you need to save, this amount of money. You need to be thinking about XYZ. And I think that coaching your adult children is so important. And just to be able to look at it from that perspective
Mhm.
rather than I mean, the parent in us still wants to, "Did you clean your room today? Did you clean
Mhm.
your room?" Like, kind of those types of things, but anyway, yeah.
Yeah, and I think sometimes, what I have found is like a lot of times my own story, my own trauma of my that being that age comes into play when I try to parent instead of like coach from an outside perspective. And that's normal, right? Because you've had your own set of trauma and you don't want to see them go through that and you want to protect them from certain things. Yet at some level they have to walk through some of their own journey so that they're able to actually become productive adults. When I was her age, when I was my daughter's age, I had gotten engaged. I had a broken engagement. So there's a lot of like, I ended up moving out of my house, getting myself in a lot of trouble with, debt because I couldn't really afford to live. And so I don't want to see her do any of that. I don't want to see her get hurt in that way. And at the same time, I have to let her figure it out for herself. And so I can guide her, but I can't tell her what to do anymore.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that is, oh my gosh, so key. It's really hard to navigate through being able to tell them what to do and then not being able to tell them what to do
Yeah.
is so important. And just even how we modeled parenting and what they can take from that so they are making good decisions.
Yeah.
And that's all we can do, right? Like just do our
Mhm.
best.
Yeah. Sometimes I have to remind my husband, like, she's not 10 anymore. There's this concept in his head where she's still his little girl that he wants to take care of and protect and do all these things. And it's like, yes, to a certain level, you'll always be a dad that wants to protect and guide your child, but she's not 10. And there's some big girl decisions that, they have to make as adults. And, I always remember my mom would tell me, Rhonda, you're going to give them roots and then you're going to give them wings. And so, and I always think about that because it's like roots and wings, and I start to get a little bit too involved. And I've made plenty of mistakes that I have to ask for forgiveness for when I've overstepped boundaries. But I try and remember roots and wings. I've given them those roots and now I need to give them wings so that they can fly. I've taught them everything that I could possibly teach them between the time they were born to the age of 18. And now I need to trust their decisions and remember that their decisions, they're the ones that have to answer to God for some of those decisions. Like, that is not my responsibility. Like, I'm not going to get to heaven and God go, well, you didn't, she did this and this wrong. Now she has her own relationship with Christ and she has to, have that relationship with him on her own. She
Yeah.
can't get to heaven on my, coattails.
Yeah. And even with that, just the consequences of their decisions and their actions, and those consequences aren't necessarily going to fall on you. I mean, maybe in some situations they could since you still have one person living at home,
Right.
but it's also, just like you were saying, we want to protect them and don't make these mistakes and don't do this and don't do that. But I just feel like, looking back, I learned so much from my mistakes. And
Mhm.
so how are they going to learn and grow if they don't
Mhm.
stumble?
Yeah, and that's hard. It's hard to watch them stumble and go through the really, really hard things because you do, as a parent, instinctively want to protect and, take care of them. And I think especially, when they're living in your home, it does make it really difficult because you still see them as a kid in some sort of weird way. You do want to cater to them. And it's hard to take that mothering instinct out of you. I think it does get easier when they move out or, when they get married. It just kind of naturally happens. But I think when you have a kid that, didn't do the regular college route, it is a little bit of a different situation and scenario. And there's a lot of parents that are in that situation where, or they go to college and they come back. Here
Yeah.
they've been on their own completely and now they come back and they're a different person. They've been independent and haven't had to answer to you in forever. And now they're back at home. So we had that also happen because, my oldest graduated during COVID. And so literally I think it was spring break. And that was when the whole COVID thing started to happen. And she never went back to school. So she was literally plucked from this life of independence right into, I'm back at my parents' house 24/7.
Wow. Yeah. So talk to us a little bit about, you have a little bit of an age gap between your oldest and your youngest right now. Talk to me a little bit about just the different parenting I guess, tools, techniques, like how you approach parenting with that age gap?
Yeah. Oh gosh. So, just to give a little history, my kids have that age gap because we did have a daughter in the middle that passed away from a heart condition. And so, I didn't intend on them being 6 years apart, but with them 6 years apart, it is a very different. I remember when I got pregnant with Kalia thinking, "Oh my gosh, all these things have changed." Like, everything is different. I mean, every baby item you could get is completely different from when Nina was, born. So, it was very different because Nina, she didn't mean to, but poor Kalia had, like, 2 moms. Like, she was like she
Mm,
had me, and then she had her older sister who wanted to take care of her and, constantly baby her. And so, yeah, I mean, it was really hard because of that age gap. I often had to tell Nina, "Hey, like, it's okay. She's fine. I'm the mom, you're not." And I mean, even as they got older, it was a little bit that dynamic. And it can even sometimes be that way even now, where, older sister wants to pour into her, but that's really like a mom role, not really a her role. And so I do think I didn't do it completely right. I mean, none of us do it just to put everyone at ease.
yeah,
We all make mistakes. We continue to make mistakes. I do not have this figured out. I'm just going to say that right up front. I just made a huge mistake 5 weeks ago by overstepping a massive boundary. And I had to sit down and apologize and repair it and not make excuses for it.
mhm,
And so that is something that I will say, when you make an error and you cross a boundary, even though there might be a million of excuses why you did it, just apologize. It's
yeah,
really in order to repair, there doesn't need to be excuses or lessons. Like, it just really needed to be an apology. And luckily,
yeah,
she accepted that apology, and I committed to not crossing that boundary ever again. And so I'm going to stay with that. And
yeah. Really quick, I wanna stay on that for just a second because I think that's so important because sometimes I feel as though parents have this, some parents could have this view of, like, a boundary, like, "What do you mean a boundary? There should be no
Mhm,
boundary. I'm mom,
mhm.
and, or I'm the parent." So, without I'm not asking you to share the details, but
Yeah.
can you give us an example of what it looks like to cross a boundary with your adult child?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think as far as like, with us, there's a rule in the house here that, like, I don't yeah, like, she's 21. Like, I'm not gonna tell her when she can and cannot come home. Like, that's up to her. But just out of respect, like, tell me what time, right? Like,
Mm,
if I'm blowing her phone up, which this wasn't the case, but if I was blowing her phone up every 15 minutes, be like, "When are you coming home? When are you coming home? When are you coming home?" Like, we've already set in place that you don't have really a curfew anymore, but if you're gonna be out late, then just text me. And for the most part, she does. But if I become this, like, overbearing mom where I'm wondering where she is at every moment of the day, that's just kind of a boundary. Like, you don't
yeah,
need to be in their business all the time. Also, I think with dating and that sort of thing, I think instinctively you just want to protect. And so you tend to, like, be like, "Oh, are you guys okay? Is everything all right with your relationship?" And crossing boundaries on things that they actually have to walk through in their own relationships. And I think that's really hard. And I will tell you that, my oldest daughter, she was 22, went through a divorce, and that was really hard because, how do you navigate that part of it when you're like a mom, you want to protect, but you also can't get super involved in the process of it. Like, we were able to support her from a back end of things, but the really hard stuff she actually had to walk through. And it was messy and it was ugly and it was not a good thing, but we walked her through it. And we were able to stay, I would say, in that situation, we were able to stay pretty boundary, but it was really hard at times. I remember her sitting down with us and just saying, "Hey, like, this is something that the two of us are going through, and you guys just need to kind of stay out of it." And she was very clear and firm with us on that. And we were able to hold that in most cases. I'm trying to think. I mean, I'm sure there were times that we did cross it, but she would always check us and be like, "Hey, cross the boundary, mom." And
yeah.
that's when I was like, "Okay, dad, cross the boundary. Okay, got it."
Oh gosh, I love that, and that's so important, and as you were saying that, it's more along the lines of walking alongside your daughter
Mhm.
rather than, like you're saying, trying to fix it and intervene and let me just do this, and so I can imagine that a lot of people deal with that, especially in the divorce situation where you have, now you have mother-in-law, father-in-law, and
Yep.
everybody wants to kinda
Yep.
have their say and have their word, and,
Mhm. Mhm.
but she's absolutely right. This is my problem and the other person's problem or, issue, and we need to figure this out on our own. And I think that that's one of the things that when I'm talking to my clients is, being really clear in, I know you want to support me and this is how you can support me.
Yes.
Nina
Yeah.
did that.
Yeah. And it's hard. I mean, I will say watching her walk through it. And I mean, I remember one situation where I walked into her apartment and she was literally just like a puddle on the floor. And I just like went to hug her and I was just like, cause we were talking before we started this podcast when they're older, you can't just fix it with, a hug and an ice cream cone. Like it doesn't work like that anymore. And so as much as, and I'm a fixer. I don't want to see my kids sad. I don't want to see them crying. I don't want to see them in distress. But at the same time, looking back, I see how much she grew in that season and how much she had to adult. Like she had to figure it out. And it was not a short process, it was a long process. And so we had to support her the best that we could with when she needed our support. And there were days that she would be like, I don't want to see anybody. I don't want to talk to anybody. And that was hard too, because I knew she was probably home, crying or depressed or sad. But she had asked us specifically, like, I don't want to talk about it and I don't want you here right now.
Wow.
And I mean, I think it's a lot easier when she wasn't living at home. Like it's harder when your kid's living at home and they're going through something like that where you're like, oh, like it's constantly in your face, There's no separation. But, I just feel like they do have to walk through those things. And we make mistakes. We'll cross the boundary. But if you can just respect your child in that way, and if they say, Mom, I asked you not to cross this boundary and you did, and you are repentant of that and say you're sorry and try not to do it again. It's really the key. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Okay, so I want to go back to the age gap, and
Yeah.
the reason I want to bring this up again is because my sister and I are 11 years apart.
Okay.
And so I'm very much relating to when I was, a teenager, she was kind of 5, 6, 7 years old. And I did take like that motherly role on and not necessarily like intending to. That wasn't my intention, but it was just like, this is my little sister and I'm responsible for her. And so,
Mhm.
but even with that, and you kind of having the 6-year age gap between your oldest and your youngest, I guess talk to me a little bit about you were also maybe in a different season when you were parenting Nina versus your
Mhm.
what is her name again?
Kalia.
Kalia, okay,
Yeah.
beautiful name. Different season in life, and so I guess my question for you is, what was that what was it like, and did you feel as though you did things differently, or were you pretty consistent in the way that parented?
Oh, completely differently. I mean, the way I was a parent with Nina, definitely I was younger, when I had her. And so the frustration level, I think, was intense with her more than it was with Kalia. Also, when I was at work full time when I had Nina. So I didn't I would say, I mean, I spent a lot of time with her. We spent a lot of time together, but there was also a lot less time that I spent with her than I did with Kalia. So, in between that time, I took some time off after my other daughter had passed. That's when I got pregnant with Kalia. And so Kalia, for me, she was what we call a rainbow baby. So she was such a blessing after a loss. And so there was a lot of doting on her and a lot of like me wanting to be very, very protective. And I think Nina also felt that. Nina also was like, well, that's my sister and I want to protect her. So yeah, I mean, definitely very different. If you ask Nina, she'll tell you that I could have never gotten away with the way she talks to you, the way, it's like I was a little more chill. I was in my 30s by the time I had Kalia. So it was
Uh,
like, it was. it wasn't that big of a deal to me. I just was a little bit more chill with her. And she had a different personality, very different personalities. So you do parent differently
Yeah,
because each kid is not the same. Kalia is more free spirited. She's more of a creative. Nina is much more in the box, A type, very business driven, very like focused all the time. And Kalia just, they were just different. They were very,
yeah,
very different.
yeah. Oh, that's yeah, and I asked you that just because, I'm thinking my sister and I were raised very differently. It's like
Mhm.
and we've talked about it, like, you were raised by different parents than I was. Like, and I think it does have a lot to do with that big age gap, but and it also is even finding myself in parenting. Being a young mom, I just I didn't know. I didn't know
Yeah.
how to parent. I didn't know how to do really anything and trying to read the books and all the things and thinking that I'm gonna be able to use the same tools and resources with my younger daughter that I did with my older daughter, but exactly what you're saying, they are so completely different
Mhm.
that I did have to parent. We do still do have to parent them differently.
Yep.
So, just being able to recognize that, and I feel like a lot of the older siblings will say, "I would have never gotten away with that," and I still hear
Yeah.
that from my
Yeah.
oldest.
I'm an older sibling, and so my brother I mean, and I also think it's very different when you have 2 girls as opposed to a boy and a girl. My brother I always joke and I'm like, "He got away with so much." Like, I would have never he was like the golden child, right? And I was like the one that was always in trouble, and it used to bug me. But I do feel like there is a natural role that you get put into, even if you're a parent that's, think you're doing it all right. Like they get put into certain roles. And so it's not intended that way, but I think it just happens. And a lot of that has to do with even us as parents, the way we were parented. My husband's reading this book right now by John Eldridge called Fathered by God. And he was telling me, oh my gosh, like reading this, like it gives me so much grace for my dad who didn't have that from his dad, and probably didn't know that. And I think that's just so important, like to understand, like, what was our family of origin when we were growing up? And how did that affect us in the way we parented? I know for me, like, I grew up in a very strict household. My dad was a minister. There was right and wrong, and there was no in between. And although they were amazing parents, I knew that there were things that I wanted to be more open with my kids about. My dad ran a drug rehab. So drugs was something we talked about all the time. That was a very open subject, but sex was not. And, coming from a church culture, they don't talk about sex and it's just off the table. You don't do it and we don't talk about it. And so I knew that when I became a parent, that was a conversation that the girls and I were going to have on a regular basis as they got to the appropriate age, because I wanted to make sure that they heard it from me and they weren't getting it from outside sources, because I felt like I didn't have that communication with
Yeah,
my parents. And it was the way they were raised. So they don't, it's no fault of theirs. It's just kind of that's what I didn't want to do with my kids. And so I think you get to choose, when Nina has her own children, she's going to probably take some great things that I did. And she's going to, I would never do that. But my mom did that so wrong.
okay, so my next question for you is, I guess, like, what advice do you have for somebody even for me, I'm kind of in this season and, you're a little bit ahead of it than I am. What advice do you have for people that are in the season of transitioning from, the high school years to adulthood? And this is a loaded question, a two-part question, but I would love for you to answer it as far as parenting, but also the relationship with your husband.
Mm, yeah. Oh, that's a good question. I think as they start to, move into that 18, 19, 20-year-old space, I think I would have liked to have done this better. I would have liked to, especially with my daughter who's living with us, because, again, when they're in college, it's a different situation. But sitting down with them and really like asking them, what was it like for me to be your mom?
Mhm.
And that's going to be a very loaded question. That was something that one of my facilitators, when I was going through a coaching program, told us to go home and ask. And she said, don't go home and ask it when you get home. Like, wait for a little bit, because you have to be ready to hear that question, right? You have to be ready for that answer, excuse me. And you might hear things that are hurtful or but just really to listen to that because I think that can strengthen your relationship with your kids. I mean, I've asked my daughters those things, and there's been a lot of good things and there's been a lot of bad things. And so as we've transitioned into adulthood, finding out like, okay, where can I improve being a mom
Yeah.
and a mom to adults? And one of the questions I'm asking now to my kids is, what boundaries do you need to put in place for yourself? I never want to be that overbearing mother-in-law in the future or, I don't want to be that person and I don't want to be in the middle of their business. I, you know, definitely don't want that either. So asking like, what are boundaries? And if we run into this problem, how do we fix it? Like if I've overstepped a boundary, how can we fix it without screaming and yelling and emotions and angry and like how can we come to a place of peace without it being offensive?
Yeah. Oh, that's so good. And that question, whew, that got me emotional. I'm like,
Mhm.
s- I don't know that I'm ready to ask that, but I recognize the importance of asking it.
Mhm.
No, I'm gonna noodle on that one.
Yeah. Yeah. And again, you have to be ready to hear the answers. And as I told you before the show, my daughter and I had a moment, my oldest daughter and I had a moment. We went through a coaching program that taught us how it was a narrative trauma coaching program. And during that program, what was really hard about it was we had to bring in a story, a childhood story. And I knew that my daughter was coming in with a story that was very connected to me. And I remember very vividly after one of the sessions, she was in a separate group. I was in a separate group. So I had no idea what really her story was about. But I knew it was probably had something to do around my relationship with her. And I remember the facilitator walking out and I came out of a room and she goes, "How are you doing?" And I just like welled up with tears. And I'm like, I feel so ashamed. Like I feel like awful that she's having to like go through this story work and it kind of is related to me and that I wasn't a good mom or whatever. And she looked at me and she said, Rhonda, she said, I wish my mom would have done this work so that we could have had a better relationship. And that just was like, okay, like I know I'm doing my own work on my own heart and with my own story so that I can be a better mom and a better wife. Like, your twofold question. Marriage is hard in the transition
Hmm.
as well. But to kind of go back to the end of the story, we had a moment at this event where there was just some worship music going on. And I walked over to her and I just said, honey, I'm so sorry that I did not hold your heart well. If, my hands were heavy to you and when they shouldn't have been, and that I just wasn't the mom that you needed me to be. And we had this beautiful moment where we just hugged and she said, "Thank you, mom, for saying that." And that to me is what repair looks like. When we can go in with an open heart, knowing we're not going to do it right. We're not going to do everything right. We're human and we will not do it right until we get to heaven, right? Like we're not going to be perfect. But if we can learn how to repair, that is something I think that is so important. And then you'll be able to have great relationships with your kids, in the future. You're able to say sorry even though you don't want to. Like maybe it wasn't even your fault, but maybe you just say like I'm really sorry for my part. You
Yeah.
know.
Yeah. That's so good.
Yeah. And as far as marriage, I mean, I will say it has probably been one of the hardest transitions and nobody talks about it. I feel like there's not a whole lot of people that talk about transitioning from, raising children to empty nest. It feels exactly that. It feels empty. There is a part of that I've had to learn to my husband the other day, he says, I'm ready to date you again. And I
Mm.
was like, oh, yeah, I don't even know what that feels like because for me, I had a child, I got pregnant shortly, like 6 months after I got married. And so really our whole life has been our children. And we don't, it's like, cutting our arm off. Like we don't even know what it's like to not, you know, have have them in our lives. And so we're navigating it. We have not done it perfect, but we're trying to work on our marriage now, like really set time aside to date and to have intentional conversation, to have deep conversation, even not be on our phones when we're watching a movie or, be on our phones if we're having a conversation at dinner. So it's very different. And it's a very, very hard transition. I'm not going to lie.
Yeah. Yeah. What are you most excited for when you look at maybe 5 years down the road? What are you most excited for as far as the relationship between you and your husband?
Just to revisit, like, why we got married, like, that excitement that you have when you're first dating somebody and getting to know them. And I feel like after you've raised children, you kind of are getting to know your husband because now you've gone through all these things in life. He's been a coach and, he's done all these things with them and I've done all these things with them. And we've all been doing everything together, but to be able to just reconnect and be just the two of us again is something that I'm excited for. Like, I'm excited to start to play golf again. Like, we haven't gone to hit golf balls or done any of that stuff in a really long time, or to just, a Saturday that's free and we get to decide what we want to do. Even in our business, like, get to strategize with our business and how we want it to look in the next 10 to 15 years as we grow old together. So,
Yeah. Oh, that's so good. I love that. And just the importance, like you were saying, of the transition of, your adult children leaving, and it's like, okay, we've been raising kids for the last 20 some odd years. Like, now what? And I'm, a true believer in people change every so many years and
mhm,
able to grow with your spouse during those changes. And so this is like another season of change for you guys and
mhm.
being able to grow together in that and having the kind of the same visions, goals that you guys want to work towards is so important.
Yeah, and I think it's hard. I mean, they say you change every 7 years,
Mm.
right?
Yeah.
So, I think it's also really hard because you want to grow together, right? You don't wanna grow apart, and I think there's a lot of things going on. Like, you've got if you're at an empty nester stage, you're probably going through menopause, and I do truly believe that men have midlife crises where they're just kinda like, "Oh my god, this is my life." It's, like, over. Like, my husband used to be like, I'm like, "You're not dying. You're not that old. Like, you're, like, 50." He acted like he was dying because he was, turned 50, and I was like, "It's not, but there is a part of your youth that you're having to say goodbye to
Mhm.
as you step into it." I mean, now I'm looking at the next thing in our life that will be exciting, and it will be grandchildren. I just saw my older daughter get married, and that was super exciting, and I'm excited that they'll have grandkids. She keeps telling me, like, "Stop asking me when I'm gonna have a grandbaby." I'm like, "But I'm ready to be a grandma." But that'll be the next thing that'll be exciting for me. So I'm trying to enjoy this season of it's just being us, because once grandkids come, I'm sure
Yeah.
she's gonna need babysitters and help and, all the things that you do when you're a mom and step into. So we're gonna probably have a little tiny season where it's us just alone, and then, we're gonna get grandkids, and hopefully, Kalia at some point will get married and I'll have another son-in-law and more grandkids. So, it's just kind of like I'm trying to enjoy the season where we don't have anything to be responsible for.
Yeah. Yeah. And yeah, just being able to embrace that season and really, it's that season of reconnection and again, like thinking about grandchildren and being a grandma and a grandpa, like being able to just kind of transition into that season together.
Yeah.
Um, that's so exciting. And I have to be careful because she's only 20, so I don't want grandkids now. But
Right?
I to run down. But if I'm
Right? I know. Every time I think about it, Nina got me a candle and it said something about like, would you like this candle instead of grandkids or something? And I was like, no, I don't want this candle. I would rather have grandchildren, but thank you.
okay, I know, God.
But
So
I'm ready. I will be ready very, very soon. But at this time, I am trying to reconnect with my husband and really like build on our relationship. And we are huge proponents of therapy. Like, we see a couples counselor. It's something that I believe is an investment for us. And when we run into really hard things, I'll be like, I'm going to call our therapist and we're going to have a conversation about this, just because it feels so good to be able to, like, have somebody to, you know, talk to and let go of some of the things that we think are so awful that maybe aren't as bad as they are. At least seem at least.
yeah, that's so good, and I think that's so healthy in a relationship to be and hard conversations aren't fun, and fighting with your
No.
spouse It's not fun,
Mhm.
but you gotta get through those, and I say this out of experience, don't shove it under the rug because it's gonna resurface at some point.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I will say that both my husband and I doing some story work has really been helpful because so much of the way we react and the way that our brains are wired have to do very much with our story. And, like I was just having a conversation with him last night about something, and I'm like, well, how did that, like, where do you think in your story that is coming up for you? And he was able to pinpoint it to something that happened in elementary school. And I'm like, but that narrative is not true anymore. Like, that's not a true statement. And so I really like encourage people to step into like, you're just because you're a grown up doesn't mean your brain knows it. And we kind of talked about it before, your brain doesn't know the difference between your childhood feelings and your adult feelings. And so really kind of just exploring like how can we do it better? Like how can we're in right now in the middle of doing a really great couples online course called Transform Your Conversations for Couples. And it's really about being honest with one another and being truthful and putting it all out there on the table and being like, hey, like, this is my ugly, messy story before you, during you, and right now. Like, how do we address this and how do we engage it?
Yeah. I and I like for the, people listening and kind of maybe in this transition of, parenting adults and then empty nesters, I think that you're and I believe this in a lot of different situations, but you're gonna show up better for yourself and for your husband when you're doing the work and you're just
Mhm.
like in in it and embracing it and working through it.
Mhm. There's a book that one of my girlfriends just told me about that I just got it. It's called Changes That Heal. It's by Dr. Henry Cloud. And it's just 4 practical steps to a happier, healthier you. And I think when you start working on yourself first, like work on you, like really work on who you want yourself to be. And it bleeds in. Like, it's like I've done so much work on myself. And, my husband naturally is like curious now about some of the things that I've learned. And, he's done a couple of coaching courses with me and it's a good thing. It's taken him a little longer to get there, but because we're both kind of on that same path to kind of wanting to understand it, I feel like we are going to walk into emptiness a little bit better. I'm not saying it hasn't been bumpy. It has been an incredibly bumpy road. And I tell him all the time, I'm like, if the minister had gotten up there and been like, Jason and Rhonda, you are going to go through blah, 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 and listed everything that we would endure, I probably would have been the runaway bride and ran out the other way because we timelined our marriage and we got done. And he goes, how do you feel about that? And I'm like, I would have never done that. Like, I would have never married you if I had known what our timeline was going to look like. But to look at our timeline and to be able to have grace for the things that we've endured and think about, oh my gosh, we've gone through all these things and we have still stayed married, good, bad, and ugly. We have stayed in it.
Yeah. And that right there is the difference between being in a marriage for the Hollywood wood romanticizing,
Mhm.
maybe way of thinking versus the actual commitment. Like that's
Right.
the difference.
Yeah. And my husband came from a divorced family. And so he never wanted, I remember when we got married, he's like, the generational curse breaks here. Right. And I loved that. And then when my daughter went through a divorce, it nearly crushed him because he was like, wait, that's not supposed to happen. Now, obviously there was a lot in her story, and that's not my story to share. But I just want to make it very clear that like toxic marriage is not okay. Like that is absolutely 100% not okay. The things that we have gone through, we've had to work through, and he's been willing to work through those things. If you have a spouse that has no desire to change and no desire to want to work through things, that's free will and that's on them, But for the most part, if you're in a marriage that your spouse wants to grow with you, you can withstand the hard stuff for sure.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, Rhonda, this has been a great conversation. I so appreciate you just sharing your expertise and offering advice. And, I learned a lot throughout our conversation. So I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I really appreciate it as well. And, I don't have it all figured out, but at least I can kind of help you walk along the journey a little bit.
Yeah, that's right.
Thank you for listening to today's episode of Emerge Stronger. To learn more about Rhonda, be sure to check out her 2 podcasts, 24 Karat Conversations and the Recovering PK podcast. Rhonda also just launched her brand new devotional ebook called When God Says No, Eat Cake. Be sure to grab your copy. This episode concludes our parenting series, and we're so grateful for all of our amazing guests who shared their expertise in various areas of parenting. Melody and I will be back next week, diving into attachment styles and how they influence our relationships. Thank you again for listening. Please don't forget to subscribe, and we would love to hear your thoughts in a review. See you next week.